All right. Well, that's good. At least one of us is ducky. So imagine this blissful domestic scene, right? So you got this husband and wife. They're sitting at home on the couch, and the wife turns to her husband and she says, "Would you like to have dinner?" And the husband responds with anticipation in his voice, "Well, what are my choices?" And the wife looks steadily and deeply into his eyes and responds, "Yes or no." So, all right. That was pretty good. Choices. It's all about choices, right? And sometimes the choices that we have. Here's a saying from Charles Galozia. I don't know if I said that right. But he says this: what is life's greatest gift? It is free will or choice. What is so great about choice? Well, it transforms us from dumb animals into artists. Each of us becomes another Michelangelo, for choice is nothing other than the chisel we use to sculpt our life. Well, I would have to say that we're doing a lot of sculpting because we're faced with so many choices every day. I mean, we live in a time of innumerable choices. So, I get up in the morning, I have to decide what I want to wear, I got to decide what I want for breakfast, I got to decide what I want to fix for lunch. And the fact that I can actually choose those things, that I have to make choices, just reveals how wealthy we are. But I must admit that, sometimes I get worn out by making decisions. Especially the one that plagues me the most is what we're going to have for dinner. Because I actually fix dinner. And so it's kind of like I fall into this routine where I just kind of go back to the old favorites, and that gets boring. So you're like, oh, I want to be creative, but it takes energy and effort and imagination to be creative. So it's just hard, to make choices all the time. As many of you know, we built a house. My wife and I built a house last year, or 2 years ago, I guess it is now. And you had to make all kinds of choices. That just wore me out. I mean, and not just the big stuff. But all the little stuff. And so you had to decide, what kind of light switches you want. You have to decide what the hinges on the doors are going to be. Even have to decide what kind of light bulbs you want. It's like, okay, really? And so I have to admit, I was able to push a lot of those decisions off on my wife, and she did a lot of that. But still, it was kind of momentous to make all those kinds of things. So making choices can be overwhelming. That's why, in my mind, the remote control is one of the technologies that is the greatest gift to humankind. Because we don't have to make choices. We can watch all the shows, right? At least little bits of them. You just, flash through them and you see a little bit of this, a little bit of that. You don't have to make any choices. That's great. It's wonderful. But Jesus knew all about making choices, right? He knew what it was to make decisions about his life. And today we're going to explore one of his most momentous decisions, and that is this idea that he had to choose to die. And so you have to remember and imagine, of course, we're approaching Easter. Think about the end of his ministry. As you get toward the end of Jesus' ministry, I imagine that he was a little bit frustrated. I mean, time was growing short, and his disciples were in many ways still very, very clueless about him and what he was about to do. And as a teacher, I understand that. Where I'm standing in front of this group of students, and I'm spewing forth all this tremendous wisdom, and you get that blank stare in their eyes. And they're like, okay, you realize they're not getting any of this. And you wonder why you're still talking. And you say, well, they're paying me to talk, so I'll just talk. But it's a little frustrating because you actually want them to learn something. And so you're hoping that they're actually getting something from this. But Jesus had at least 3 years with his disciples. Yet in the end, they still didn't really understand who he was or what he was about. And so, for example, we have this repeated scene in the Gospels where he keeps telling them exactly what's going to happen when they get to Jerusalem. He says, we're going to get there, and I'm going to be handed over to the chief priest, and I'm going to be beaten and scourged, and I'm going to be killed. And they still don't really know what's going to happen. And when it happens, they're completely taken by surprise, as if he hadn't told them. In fact, there's this really telling scene in the Gospel of Luke. If you remember the Last Supper scene in Luke, so here Jesus has just, you can imagine with kind of a very somber heart expressed to him that he is going to be poured out, that his body will be, his blood will be shed for them, his body is going to be given for them. And immediately the disciples begin to talk about which one of them is greatest. And you're thinking, okay, Jesus is wanting a little kind of commiseration with his best friends, and they don't get it. And you just, see him throwing up his hands in frustration. Here he's about to sacrifice himself on their behalf, and they're arguing over status and position. And it's like, oh man, you have to wonder, did Jesus have second thoughts? Is this really worth it? are they really worth it? And one of the places we actually see Jesus thinking twice about this whole business is in the garden. And Mark, more than any of the other gospel writers, I think, portrays the anguish of Jesus in these final hours. So we're going to look at Mark chapter 14, beginning in verse 32. They went to a place called Gethsemane. And he said to his disciples, "Sit here while I pray." He took with him Peter and James and John, and he began to be distressed and agitated. And he said to them, "I am deeply grieved, even to death. Remain here and keep awake." And going a little farther, he threw himself on the ground and prayed that if it were possible, the hour might pass from him. He said, "Abba, Father, for you all things are possible. Remove this cup from me. Yet not what I want, but what you want." He came and found them sleeping, and he said to Peter, "Simon, are you sleeping? Could you not keep awake 1 hour? Keep awake and pray that you may not come into the time of trial. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak." And again he went back and he prayed, saying the same words. Here is a picture of Jesus in anguish. I mean, the language of Mark is emotionally charged. Jesus is distressed. He's agitated. He says that his soul is grieved to the point of death. And after separating himself a little bit, he falls prostrate on the ground and he pleads with God to find another way. He's looking at the cross with dread. And he wants to know, is there another option? Is it possible for this cup to pass? Can God accomplish what he seeks to accomplish without requiring Jesus to die? And so he pleads for an alternative. He says, "God, you can do anything you want. Don't do it this way." So what makes it all the more distressing is the silence. You see, there's several occasions in the gospel where you have this heavenly voice of God reassuring Jesus. At the baptism, at the transfiguration, the voice comes down. "This is my son." Love it. But here, in the garden, there's no voice. There's utter silence. And his companions are asleep. And Jesus, it seems, is utterly alone. Now, the humanity of Jesus, I think, is disturbing to some, especially when you look closely at it. I mean, why is Jesus troubled after all? How could he ask such a question? Isn't this God in the flesh? Isn't this what he came to do? Isn't this what he's supposed to do? How could he ask for another way? That just seems odd. Yet questions such as this, I think, reveal a misunderstanding of the incarnation. Christians believe that Jesus is both fully divine and also fully human. Yet I think it is difficult for us as humans to hold those two aspects of Jesus together. And people often emphasize one side of that equation versus the other. And most devout Christians often err on the side of divinity. And I remember as a child, I often thought of Jesus as purely God. In fact, I imagined him even as a human walking around Galilee, and he had the glowing nimbus, that you see in Christian art. Everybody could see. That's why when he called his disciples, they followed, because they saw the glowing nimbus. Oh, that's the Messiah, clearly. And I didn't really understand the humanity of Jesus as a kid. But to forget the humanity of Jesus is to fail to appreciate his true sacrifice on our behalf. We need to recognize that Jesus is human. He's a man like us. He has choice. He has free will. And to deny him choice is to deny him the power to be human. And throughout his life, Jesus is constantly making choices. So, for example, at his baptism, when he comes to be baptized by John, he is choosing the path that God had called him to. But he could have chosen otherwise. He could have stayed in Nazareth. He could have settled down with a nice young girl and become a carpenter like his dad, and perhaps lived in seclusion without any trouble, without any agitation. But then you say, well, wait a minute. How would we be saved? What about God's plan? What about God's will? And I would say, well, I think God's plan included Jesus having free will. Jesus having choice. But what about the temptations of the wilderness? Let's think about those for a minute. I mean, if Jesus is not enticed in any way by these temptations of Satan, the temptations that are placed before him, then those stories simply become a farce. It's just play acting. It's just a scene. To be truly tempted, there has to be something that is enticing in what is offered. And so, for example, if you were to put a plate of chicken hearts in front of me and say, you need to eat this, I'm like, no, not really. I'm not enticed by that at all. It would be easy for me to say no to that. And there's no spiritual or moral victory in me turning that down. But you put a nice, juicy steak, cooked to perfection, with the smell coming forth. I'm like, oh, yes. Then there would be moral victory to me turning that down. Right? So Jesus is truly tempted. As the Hebrew writer reminds us, Jesus is able to sympathize with us because he was tested in every way as we are. He knows what it's like to be human. Jesus knows the struggles that we go through, and he himself experiences those desires and the pulls and longings of the world and knows what it's like to face them. He knew what it was like to be a teenager with raging hormones, and he knows what it's like to be criticized and mistreated and rejected. He knows the human experience. He understands what it's like to struggle and to be obedient to parents even when you think you know better than they do. Right? Imagine Jesus having to be submissive to parents, to mom and dad. Mom and dad, that's how it is. He can sympathize with those who are hurt, with those who face doubt from loved ones or betrayal from friends. He knows all of that. He knows our experience. And in every struggle and at every turn, Jesus was saying yes to the plan of God, to the mission of God. Every day was a choice to continue, especially when people kept missing the point or they were trying to use him to their own ends. And he knew, and he could tell what was going on. But now he's in the garden. And the cross lies close at hand, and he's seeking another way. And perhaps he had thought of alternatives before this. You can imagine, him maybe daydreaming about slipping away into the night or asking his disciples to fight for him. In Matthew he says, I could have called down 10 legions of angels. Maybe that would be a good option. How could there not be moments where different scenarios ran through his head? He said, what if? What if I had chosen differently? What if this had happened? But here we are in the garden. And when we hear this story of the garden, we shouldn't think of some dispassionate God who's untroubled by the temporary afflictions of this life, as if he could just brush them off. Jesus is fully human. And he knows fear. And he knows dread and anguish and pain. And he has a choice to make. It's the final temptation. Now, some of you might be squirming in your seats thinking, well, this is my Jesus you're messing with. Maybe your Jesus is too divine. Maybe you've written off the human side of Jesus. Christians often get squeamish when Jesus appears a little bit too much like us. And some of the older members of our congregation, perhaps, might remember back to 1988, there was a controversial movie that came out called The Last Temptation of Christ. And I remember it just from the protests. I didn't see it at the time, but there were ministers all across the country calling for a boycott of this movie. Don't go see this movie. Horrible movie. Well, I didn't see it back then, but it's since been on television. I watched it on television, and I'm thinking, well, what's all the fuss about this movie? And then I realized, well, they probably heard the storyline, and they didn't really ever see the movie, and so they were just imagining what it might be like. Now, I will say this, having seen the movie, it's not a particularly good movie, okay? So it's not good in terms of just movie quality and stories of Jesus as they go. But there's aspects to it that I think are really intriguing and interesting as we look at that. So some of the most controversial scenes come toward the end of the movie, where Satan is going to tempt Christ with a normal life. And he's going to tempt him to say, well, what if you were just an everyday person, normal person, and that you could pursue that life free from being the savior of the world? And so the final temptation in the film actually occurs while Jesus is on the cross. It becomes a dream sequence, right? So if you don't know the movie, you think Jesus is living this normal life. It's all part of this dream that he has while he's on the cross. So he's on the cross, and there's a young girl who is the Satan figure who comes and says, oh, you've proved yourself, you've done enough, you can now come down from the cross, and you can have that normal life, and you can marry, and you can have children, and you can go off and just do your own thing. And so he follows the story of Jesus if he were just a normal guy. And so he gets married, comes down off the cross, and he gets married, and he doesn't have to be Messiah, and he can live a normal life, and he can have a family, and everything's great. And he lives that life. But toward the end of that life, in this dream sequence, he finally realizes that he's abandoned his call, abandoned his duty, and he begins to recognize what that will mean for those who love him. And he realizes that evil is going to gain the victory. And he sees just how essential his death on the cross is. And so he begs God to return him to the cross, finally rejecting the temptation of Satan. And at that point in the movie, he awakens and he's back on the cross. Now, I'm not suggesting that in any way the film has captured reality, but Scorsese, the director, at least takes very, very seriously the choice of Jesus. In fact, he might be one of the director who captures that the most in all of the Jesus films. Question of why should Jesus die? What does he get? Why not live a normal, peaceful, comfortable existence like any other human would? I mean, after all, the people that he's going to be dying for don't deserve it. He's despised by the religious leaders. The crowds are becoming kind of indifferent and some of them even hostile. And his closest followers end up betraying and denying him and cowering in fear. Yet in his final prayer in the garden, as always, his words are, not me, but you. I choose your will, Father, not my own. It's not what I want, but it's what you want. So why does Jesus die? Now, we could go off in all kinds of theological terms and talk about the complex theology behind it. Atonement, propitiation, reconciliation, justification. And I don't really want to talk about any of those aspects this morning. What I want us to think about is something more basic, something even more fundamental to this question. Jesus chose to die to free us from ourselves. Oh yes, he provides grace and forgiveness and a new life and all those wonderful things, but he also provides us a way out, the way of freedom. A way of freedom from sin and its oppressive weight. Jesus shows us the way we were meant to live, what was truly intended by God from the very beginning. He shows through his death not only that he can reclaim us, but he also shows us the way that we ourselves should walk. Jesus is the pattern. He is the one that sets the road for us. And Christians very early on recognized that his death not only had this salvific aspect to it, but it also was a call to imitation. And Paul, in the passage we've already read this morning, recognizes this as well. So let's read Philippians again, chapter 2, verse 3 through 8. Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility regard others as better than yourselves. Let each of you not look to your own interest, but to the interest of others. Let the same mind be in you that was in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not regard equality with God as something to be exploited, but emptied himself, taking the form of a slave, being born in human likeness. And being found in the human form, he humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. See, Jesus shows us the correct way to make choices. That when we make choices, it's not about me, it's about you. We live in this world of conflict. And we, of course, recognize that conflict is all around us. I mean, of course, just turn on the news and you're going to have whatever the latest war is, whether it's Iraq or Afghanistan or Syria. I mean, it just rotates from location to location. There's always a war going on somewhere. Multiple wars. Or you can turn it on and you can see the latest terrorist attack or crazy person running through a crowd, with a car, whatever it might be. There's always some kind of act of violence. that reminds us we live in a world of conflict. But we don't have to go, of course, that far away to recognize conflict even in our own lives, in a more personal form, whether that be struggles in a marriage or a friendship, tension with your boss or your coworker. Somebody has done something to you or said something to you or implied something that hurts you. Conflict. But in these more personal conflicts, we must always ask, well, what is my role in this? What have I done? And what might I do to make it better? See, Christ came to free us from ourselves. But it is often to ourselves, which we hold most tightly, that we view everything through that lens, the lens of self. And so when people are unhappy, they often like to put the blame on others, right? It's someone else's fault. I'm the victim here. I have rights. I'm owed. I have needs. I have desires. It's all about me. Yet Christ could have said all of these things. After all, what he did deserved death. Those for whom he was dying were ungrateful and ignorant, yet he chose to die anyway. He said, not me, but you. Christ came to teach us how to have peace. How to have peace with God, how to have peace with ourselves, how to have peace with others in a world of conflict. John Forrest Dulles, I've never heard of this guy. He was the Secretary of State, former Secretary of State, back in the 50s, I guess, or maybe in the 40s. He once said this. He said, the world will never have lasting peace so long as men reserve for war the finest human qualities. Peace, no less than war, requires idealism and self-sacrifice and a righteous and dynamic faith. And I found this a truly intriguing statement, but it seems true. What Dulles is highlighting is these tremendous stories of sacrifice that are often associated with war, where you find stories about people putting themselves on the line for others. And think about how many war movies you perhaps have seen where this is exactly the theme of the story. Stories of bravery and sacrifice. Stories like, for example, Saving Private Ryan or We Were Soldiers. I mean, you have countless war movies where typically, of course, it's soldiers putting their lives on the line for fellow soldiers. Not the enemy, of course, but for fellow soldiers. There's this other movie that popped into my head when I was thinking about this, and that's the movie named Glory. I don't know if anybody's seen this. It's a kind of old movie. Hey, a lot of my movies are old, but not old. Sorry. But Matthew Broderick is portraying Colonel Robert Shaw. He's the historic figure who leads the first U.S. Civil War's all-black volunteer company. And it follows their story as they form this company and then they begin to engage in battle. In the final scene of the movie, Shaw volunteers his company to lead a charge against the rebel fort. And he knows that whoever leads this charge, that they're going to suffer extreme casualties. And he volunteers knowing that he and maybe many, if not most, of his company will die in the onslaught. And his men follow him into the breach, even as they're being mowed down by enemy fire, because they're fighting for something more important than themselves. They're fighting for an ideal, for an image of what might be, what could be, of freedom. And I think this is where Dulles is right. We have those images of people willing to give their very lives for something they believe in. And he says, that's the key to peace, when we're willing to do that for peace. The same kind of self-sacrifice that we find in war, because true victory only comes through surrender. Surrender of our wants and our needs for the sake of others. Surrender of our will for the will of the Father. Surrender of our ego, of our pride, of our arrogance. Jesus has come to show us that way. I invite the praise teams to come up as we close. Jesus shows us the path of humility, of recognizing that until we get our eyes off ourselves and see others, we'll never have peace. Jesus shows us that we must choose by recognizing it's not about me, it's about you. That is the way of Christ. Let's Let's pray.